we are going to talk in this panel about where trade and the climate intersect. And freer trade and a greener climate are, I think, two enormously important goals. One is a tried and tested route to prosperity. Addressing climate change is the greatest challenge of our time. They're both also areas where multilateralism has been the key forward, and multilateralism is not in great shape right now. And they're also, I think, areas where many people, particularly some of the people protesting out on the streets today, think these two are in tension. There is an increasing view that freer trade is not good for the climate. And so I wanted to kind of start with that and talk a bit about whether that's true, and if it isn't, how we make sure that freer trade is good for the climate and how we can have a win-win. So, Prime Minister, I wanted to start with you just with the very simple question. Is freer trade good for the climate?
Very simple question with a complex answer. It should be. But one of the issues we have, of course, is, as you point out, have we built the social license? Do people genuinely believe that free trade is delivering the outcomes that we need? And so I think if we start with building social license as a starting point, then we start to rethink the way that we're using our tools. And so it's as simple as bringing alignment between the environmental goals, indeed expectations we should have upon ourselves, with actually our trade tools and our trade devices. And we're not doing that at present. So let's start with our free trade agreements. We have the ability when we negotiate, be it multilateral or bilateral agreements, to make sure that we are embedding environmental principles within them that are in keeping with our stated aspirations and goals. Secondly, let's use the WTO to remove the distortions that currently exist, and fossil fuel subsidies to the tune of $500 billion is an obvious example, and yet for 10 years we have been trying to remove those. And thirdly, let's incentivize. Why don't we create specific trade tools that say, well, between ourselves, we will eliminate tariffs on goods and services that will address climate issues. So solar panels, wind turbines, LED lights, and actually New Zealand is advocating for that. We'll be making an announcement today about that very kind of trade instrument alongside like-minded countries. So the answer is yes, but we haven't developed that and delivered that fully.
So yes, it can be.
It can be, we just have work to do.
Commissioner Malmstrom, you have, as Trade Commissioner of the EU, really pushed this in your trade deals, and particularly, I think, in the Mercosur trade deal, which has just been finalized, but yet at the same time, that is a trade deal that has become incredibly politically unpopular because there is a view that this is sort of accelerating the burning down of the rainforest. So can you talk a bit about how you think you can incorporate in climate change goals in trade agreements?
Well, I agree very much with the Prime Minister that if trade is well done, it can be something that supports a sustainable development. We are in the European Union embedding in all our trade agreements strong chapters on sustainable development based on international conventions on labor and on human rights, but also on environment. We are reflecting international conventions on endangered species, illegal logging, and references in the last ones to the Paris Agreement, making them binding, saying that what we all agreed upon in the Paris Agreement, the commitments that everybody has made, and they're quite specific, are reflecting in a binding way in our trade agreements. And that is a way to keep countries engaged. And also, because the trade agreement is part of a bigger cooperation partnership, we can also cooperate in research, in innovation, etc., to make it happen. And the Mercosur agreement has been very much criticized lately because of the fires in Amazon, which is, of course, extremely worrying because they are the lungs of the planet, but you cannot accuse the Mercosur agreement of causing that. The Mercosur agreement just was politically agreed in June. It hasn't entered into force yet. It will take another 2 years at least before it entered into force. It's not translated yet. It's not legally scrubbed. So it's still time to go. But we think that is a way to, for instance, keep Brazil and others in the climate agreement and make sure that they live up to what they have promised there.
So just to be clear on that, that means there is a linkage between a trade agreement and the climate agreement. So if a country has a trade agreement with the EU, it can't then leave the Paris Agreement.
No, and that is why we cannot right now have a comprehensive trade agreement with the US.
because the US is, the US would basically have to commit to Paris Agreement before it could have a comprehensive trade agreement with the EU.
True.
I'm going to come back onto more of that tariff stuff, but I want to bring our two financiers in here, our two bankers, and the comment you made earlier about fossil fuel subsidies. And I think that's one of the most distorted parts of the world economy, is the fact that we still subsidize fossil fuels. We also don't have enough money going to green technologies on the financing side. We talked about that on earlier panels. Do the two of you think that how much would the financial flows change if you actually got rid of fossil fuel subsidies? Would that change?
If we got rid of what?
If we got rid of fossil fuel subsidies. If you actually made serious progress there, would that dramatically affect the allocation of capital that you would give to those industries? Tidjane.
So you said the impact of eliminating fossil fuel subsidies on trade patterns. Look, I think that process is underway anyway. The world economy is moving. When you talk to the oil and gas sector, this is a sector where we're very active as Credit Suisse, that dialogue is now at the CEO level, how to transition from the model we have to a more efficient and a cleaner model. So there's a lot of work being done on that, good dialogue, and I think it's moving in the right direction. Now, it's a bit difficult to predict the direct impact on trade. What I think is that all those efforts are going to produce better quality growth and more sustainable growth, which will then in turn lead to better quality trade, if you wish. Because if you think about the impact of climate change, particularly on the poor countries, the vulnerable countries, you really need to change the way people operate. For instance, the lack of access to energy is one of the key causes of destruction of the environment in all those countries.
Absolutely, but if I can almost ask the same question to you, Mike. If you manage to get rid of these subsidies, would that change the environment dramatically for the kinds of things that you would finance? Because there's a lot of talk about green bonds, there's a lot of talk about pushing capital towards renewables, but would you have a bigger impact if you actually got rid of subsidies?
Well, I think one of the big things that would likely come out of it is today, what we see in the world in some ways is there's fear around this nexus of trade and climate. And what I mean by that is that while globalization has been great and trade has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, there's the other side of that around the protectionism of people having lost jobs. And I think as people then conflate climate into that and subsidies into that, I fear that people pull back and move slower at those than they otherwise would. So one, I think it would be great to do that. And I think we would see some shifts. Right? Because again, you just look at what's going on between the US and China. We've seen trade routes realign, manufacturing realign very quickly. So I think as subsidies went, prices changed, you would see manufacturers, you'd see demanders of goods and services realigning against that quickly.
Are you going to be pushing for that as part of your focus on greener, the financial sector's role in assisting efforts to combat climate change? Will you be loudly pushing for reduced subsidies for fossil fuels?
Go on.
Short answer, yes, but not loudly, but pushing, yes. Because we tend to think that, anyway, lobbying and pushing is more effective if it's done not too loud a manner. And that's what we do with the companies we finance. We engage constructively with them to get them to change, and we find that more effective often than noise.
I wanted to turn, because we've got very little time left, to another not uncontroversial subject, which is the use of carbon tariffs. Because we're in a world now where people seem to think it's okay to slap tariffs on everything. So the European Union, I know, is with the new president of the European Commission, climate is very high on the agenda. And there are increasing calls for, well, maybe we have to introduce carbon adjustment tariffs in the European Union. If other people aren't going to pull their weight and we're going to do more, then let's introduce those. Do you think that's likely to happen, Commissioner? And would it be a good thing for the global trading system?
It would certainly be a good thing to do so. And the more countries who's involved in this, the better, of course. So we would seek to broadly cooperate. Exactly how to do it is, of course, still not clear. The new incoming president of the European Commission, Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, has been very clear that she wants to do this. And I know that there are lots of good brains all over the European Union working on trying to find ways to do it that is not discriminatory and that really serves its purpose. Maybe you can start likely with a few sectors and then build from that. But exactly how to do it, I think we still need some talks. I know there are discussions in other countries as well, New Zealand, I think, and Canada, and within the OECD, there are discussions. So if we can do a broad initiative there, I think it would be really, really good for the climate. But probably you have to start a little bit sooner.
Prime Minister, what's your view, both of the likelihood and also the politics? I mean, the WTO is already under huge strain.
Yeah.
If you suddenly have the Europeans saying we're going to introduce carbon tariffs.
Well, it has to be in compliance with WTO rules, of course. Otherwise, it's not.
Would the US not just leave?
Yeah, and I think, you know, you've already raised the complexity with taking that as an option. There'd be definitional issues, there'd be issues around how it was constructed and maintained. I think actually, if we're looking for speed, which is ultimately what we need in this climate crisis, then let's use some of the tools we already have. If we were all using some domestic and appropriate form of carbon pricing, including, for instance, in New Zealand, we have an emissions trading scheme. If we were all adopting an approach like that, then we would be, I think, removing some of the disparity that exists between us. And this is a huge issue domestically. How do I convince different industries in New Zealand that it's important for us to have a comprehensive emissions trading scheme and carbon pricing if they look at their international competitors and see that that's not applying elsewhere? So that is a mechanism that already exists that we should have an expectation is being applied domestically. And on the flip side, tools and devices like, for instance, removing tariffs to incentivize the trade of goods and services that are basically good for the planet and green technology is another way that we can enhance the trade and production of those technologies.
Do any of you have any expectation that this can happen at a multilateral level? That we can actually see progress at the WTO, or is this going to be enlightened countries?
Perhaps one of the reasons we're creating a device that you know, we are seeking other countries to sign on to, but we've started small and we will grow that device, is because obviously, although ultimately we are working very hard to try and support, uphold and maintain the WTO as an institution, we also operate in reality right now. We've got to keep moving in spite of that.
Those two are not necessarily easy to do in tandem. Mike, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think we've seen in the numbers that have been talked about this week and before that we probably need to take more radical action than that. I'm a big believer in a combination of the stick and the carrot. And I think in many ways, it's the carrot that's got the ability to get us there. We have got to start thinking outside the box and incentivizing people. So I don't just like having the stick, because I think the stick leads to a rationality of behavior. Fine, I can do that. I'll pay for that. I'll factor that in. My economics will cover that. We need to change the paradigm, and we've got to incentivize people to innovate so that we really bend the curve.
Absolutely, and that's extremely important, but who is the we in this? I mean, we have two members, extremely esteemed members of the private sector, two government representatives. Is this a public-private partnership? Is it the public sector? Is it the private sector? Because
yes.
Both.
Okay, well, let's put some pressure on that.
It's all of it. It's got to be.
Has to be.
You know, when you think about where we are today, you think about what's going on, in many ways, I would describe the way we're going that in different directions. I would argue that the business leaders that I meet with, Citi's approach, certain Tidjane's approach, is it's the tone from the top, and we're driving it, and we're putting pronouncements, and we're putting markers out there. And the rest of the organization follows us. I would argue from the public sector is kind of coming at this from a groundswell perspective, or more as a groundswell perspective, and the leaders are kind of coming after and understanding that. And you can see in the numbers here this week of, you know, we don't have unanimity amongst big parts of governments in terms of the direction we're headed. I think if you get business in a room, you would find much closer alignment. And I think the tone from the top of saying, we're going to take this, we don't know exactly how we're going to get there, but we're going to figure it out.
I think very at the top, both in the private and the public sector, you get the awareness and the desire to move in that direction. And one thing that's clear is the clients. When I think about our clients who in the end drive your business, drive my business, most of them are global. They are multi-region, multi-trade regions, if you wish, and they think about the world as one place. And as we accompany them, we invest with them, I think things will get better. But absolutely, those partnerships are essential to have, if you wish, the right conditions for the world economy to thrive. I think there's no other option.
So all of that is very upbeat, and I hope you do all get together and do that. But one concern is, are you running out of time in the court of public opinion? Because if you see the people who have the energy, who are bringing the focus on the need to act on the climate, they do think that trade is a bad idea and that it is bad for the climate. And how do you change that narrative? How do you bring these two together so that the climate activists don't think that it's a bad thing? Commissioner.
Well, we have actually tried to engage with them in the European Union, with the climate activists, with environmental organizations, consumer organizations, trade unions, others who might have critical views on that. Try to listen to them, to engage them in the negotiations, take their advice, and make them a sort of permanent advisory group to what we do in trade negotiations. Open up so they can see what we're doing, but also listening to their advice and knowledge and see how we can include that in our trade agreements. Trade cannot solve all the problems of the world, but it can be a factor if it's well done. And trade is also about trading environmentally friendly goods, and that I fully agree that should be much cheaper and easier. It's also about changing ideas and innovation and pooling resources when it comes to research and new technologies. Right. And isolating and closing the doors will definitely not help the climate.
Prime Minister?
No, please.
Yeah, time is running out in the court of public opinion because time is running out for us to address climate change. So I think it's right that they hold our feet to the fire. But on trade, actually, one of the issues we've had is that it's become really a tool for blame. Actually, we have to start taking some domestic ownership. If the trade agreements were not delivering greater equality, greater reduction of the income divide between the well-off and the poor in our countries, our own domestic policies have to answer that question as well. And the same, I would say, for environmental policy. Trade cannot carry the brunt of the blame, but it can actually provide some of the answers. We have to negotiate, though, agreements that are gold standard agreements, and we're looking to do that between New Zealand and the EU and the FTA we're currently trying to negotiate. The more that we do that, the more we will bring people with us, but it should never, ever be used as a tool for blame. We have to take some ownership.
We have very little time.
Very important point on that. I think it's vital to acknowledge the negative effects of trade. Too often people like us who are pro-trade say, well, the benefits outweigh the downsides. That's not sufficient as an answer, and that's what the activists are saying. We need to have explicit answers to the negative effects, not just saying that the positive effects outweigh them. And I think that's really a central point.